Dr. Ethan Caldwell was the kind of man people pointed at when they wanted to describe success. At 35, he was already a leading surgeon in Houston, a city famous for its world-class medical centers. His name carried weight in operating rooms at Houston Methodist and the Texas Medical Center. Colleagues respected his precision and calm authority. Patients trusted him with their lives, and the medical community knew him as one of the best. On paper, Ethan had everything: skill, wealth, a reputation many would envy, and the kind of career that only relentless discipline could build. He lived in a 2-story modern home on the edge of a quiet neighborhood, a place that mirrored his taste for order and clean lines. Every detail of his days was organized with the same care he applied in surgery. He woke before dawn, worked out with military precision, and arrived at the hospital before most had poured their first cup of coffee. In the evenings, he didn't collapse into a couch like so many of his peers. He preferred activity, running along Buffalo Bayou, riding horses when he could find time, skiing on winter trips, and, more than anything, fishing. Fishing wasn't just a hobby, it was his meditation, his way of silencing the noise of a city that never stopped humming. Ethan loved the simplicity of a rod, a line, and the stillness of a lake more than any expensive party he could be invited to. Despite his physical discipline and polished appearance, his private life was a blank page. Rumors circulated among nurses and even some of his colleagues. How could a man like him still be single? Some whispered that he was indifferent to women. Others speculated crueler things about his masculinity. Ethan never bothered to deny or confirm any of it. He wasn't ashamed, nor was he inclined to prove himself to anyone. His victories, personal or professional, were his own business. The truth was far simpler. He had dated, he had experienced fleeting romances, but none of them had lasted, and he never felt compelled to announce them. Relationships came and went, and for Ethan, they had never filled the empty space he carried with him. That emptiness had roots stretching back to childhood. Ethan's parents, both highly respected doctors, were brilliant but perpetually absent. His father was a cardiologist often called into emergency procedures. His mother, an oncologist, traveled frequently for conferences and spent long nights on call. For Ethan, home was a place of quiet rooms and hurried meals. He was left mostly with his grandmother, a stern woman who provided food and discipline but little warmth. She dressed him neatly, ensured his homework was done, and sent him to school on time, but affection was scarce. Ethan grew up learning not to expect hugs or tender words. By the time he was in middle school, he was accustomed to solitude. He cooked simple meals for himself, kept the house tidy, and rarely complained. If he invited a girl over, no one noticed. If he stayed out late, no one waited up. Independence wasn't a choice, it was a survival skill. As a young man, Ethan poured his energy into academics and then into medicine. He graduated with honors, completed his residency with distinction, and built a career step by step, each achievement stacked on top of the last. There were setbacks, of course: grueling hours, failed relationships, the endless exhaustion of medical training. But he endured them the way he endured long hours in the OR, silently, without complaint, driven by a goal he could never quite articulate. He told himself it was about being the best, about saving lives, but deep down he knew it was also about filling the silence inside him with something that mattered. Now, in his mid-30s, Ethan's life looked enviable to outsiders. He drove a sleek black Lexus, wore suits tailored in downtown boutiques, and enjoyed every comfort money could provide. Yet when he returned home at night, silence greeted him. The refrigerator hummed, the house stood immaculate, and no one asked how his day had gone. He told himself he preferred it that way, that freedom was worth more than attachment. But sometimes, while casting a line over still water or looking at the lights of the city from his balcony, he wondered what all of it was for. He was admired, even envied. But admiration is not companionship, and envy is not love. Ethan Caldwell, the brilliant surgeon of Houston, seemed to have everything a man could want, except someone to share it with. And in those quiet moments, he felt the hollowness most of all. Outside the bright glass doors of a Houston supermarket, Dr. Ethan Caldwell slowed his steps. The April air was unseasonably cold, sharp with wind that cut down the street and slipped beneath his tailored coat. He had stopped on his way home to grab a few things, a routine errand that should have taken minutes. But on the bench near the entrance, a scene pulled him from his stride. A young woman sat huddled with a boy of about 7, both clutching their thin jackets tighter against the chill. The boy's knees were drawn up, his sneakers scuffed, his shoulders trembling, not just from the cold, but from exhaustion. The woman, barely out of her 20s, kept glancing at him, her face pale with worry. Ethan noticed the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, trying to smile for the boy, though her eyes betrayed a deep weariness. Something about the pair stopped him. He wasn't in the habit of intervening in strangers' lives, but the contrast between the warmth of the supermarket's lights and the two figures outside was stark. They weren't waiting for anyone. They looked stranded. He approached gently, not wanting to startle them. "Are you two all right?" he asked. His voice carried the calm tone he often used with nervous patients. The woman hesitated before answering. "We're fine," she murmured, though the boy's lips were blue with cold. Ethan crouched slightly to meet the boy's gaze. That was when he noticed it, the uneven way the child's legs were positioned, the subtle favoring of one side. "Your leg," Ethan said softly. "What happened?" The boy looked at his mother, uncertain if he should answer. She exhaled, then admitted, "He fell off a bike months ago. It hasn't healed right. We haven't been able to see a doctor." It was a statement heavy with subtext. In Houston, where hospitals towered like monuments, the only reason a child wouldn't be seen was money. Ethan's chest tightened. He had treated countless children for injuries far less severe, families with insurance that covered every detail. But here was a boy limping through pain because his mother had no means. He straightened, running a hand over his jaw as an idea formed. This wasn't just pity, it was instinct. He had room in his home, the resources, and, if he was honest with himself, an ache for company. "Look," he began, carefully addressing the woman. "I know this might sound unusual. My name's Ethan Caldwell. I'm a surgeon here in Houston. I live alone, and I've been considering hiring someone to help keep up my house. It's large and I work long hours. If you're looking for work, I could use a housekeeper." The woman blinked at him, startled. "You don't even know me," she said. "You're right," Ethan admitted. "But I can see you're in a difficult situation. And I can promise you this. I'm not the kind of man who would hurt you or your son. You'd have a roof over your head, steady income, and safety. I can also make sure your boy gets the medical care he needs." For a long moment, silence stretched between them, filled only by the shuffle of carts and the automatic doors sliding open and shut. The boy's small hand slipped into hers, as if asking her to consider. She drew a breath. "I'm Grace Miller, and this is Danny." Ethan nodded, relieved at the first step of trust. "It's good to meet you, Grace. What do you think?" Grace looked down at her son, then back at the man who seemed too polished, too composed to be real. Everything about her screamed caution. She knew the dangers women faced when desperate. But she also saw the sincerity in his eyes, the quiet steadiness that belonged to someone used to holding lives in his hands. Finally, she whispered, "All right, we'll come." That night, Ethan carried groceries into his immaculate house, and behind him trailed Grace and Danny. The boy's eyes widened at the spacious rooms, the glow of warmth, the stocked kitchen. Grace moved carefully, still uncertain if this was the right choice, but already grateful that her son was no longer shivering outside. It was an arrangement born of chance, but as Ethan watched them settle in, Grace's cautious steps, Danny's hesitant smile, he felt a stirring he hadn't expected. The silence that once welcomed him home was broken, replaced by the faint sound of life. Neither of them knew it yet, But this moment marked the beginning of a bond that would change all of their lives. The next few days settled into a rhythm that felt strange at first, but gradually began to feel natural. Grace moved through Ethan's large house with quiet determination, tidying rooms that had once stood untouched for weeks, cooking meals that warmed the air with scents Ethan hadn't realized he missed. She was careful not to intrude on his space, always asking before adjusting anything. But Ethan noticed small differences immediately. The laundry folded, the kitchen counters gleaming, fresh linens on his bed. Danny, too, changed within days. No longer confined to the cold or to meager meals. The boy's cheeks flushed with color, and his eyes brightened with curiosity. He marveled at Ethan's collection of medical books, touching the spines with reverence, and often sat at the wide windows overlooking the street, watching the world go by as though it were a movie. Ethan was gone most of the day, immersed in surgeries, consultations, and the unending hum of hospital life. Yet each evening when he returned, there was a subtle shift. The house, once echoing with silence, now greeted him with the clatter of pans or the murmur of Grace's voice reading softly to Danny. The loneliness he had carried so long began to recede, though he didn't dare name the feeling. Still, Ethan remained cautious. He treated Grace with a professional courtesy, as though she were a colleague rather than a housekeeper. He thanked her for meals, nodded his approval at the order she maintained, but never crossed into personal territory. She mirrored his restraint, keeping their conversations polite and measured. It was not romance. It was a truce of sorts, two adults carefully navigating unfamiliar ground. But Ethan's attention was repeatedly drawn to Danny. He couldn't ignore the boy's limp, the way he shifted uncomfortably when walking too far, or the subtle wince when he thought no one was looking. For a surgeon like Ethan, the signs were unmistakable. The leg hadn't healed properly. Without intervention, the child's future would be burdened with pain and limitations. One evening, Ethan returned earlier than usual. He found Danny on the back patio, a sketchpad balanced on his lap, drawing crooked lines that slowly formed into a crude fishing rod and a fish. Ethan smiled faintly. "You like fishing?" he asked. Danny looked up, startled, then nodded. "My mom told me about it. I've never gone." Ethan sat down beside him, his gaze drifting to the boy's leg. "You'd like it," he said, "but it's not much fun if you can't run to the water or stand steady on the bank." The boy's expression faltered, his small hand tightening on the pencil. Ethan's chest tightened in response. In that moment, the thought solidified he had to help. Not out of obligation, not even out of pity, but because he could, and because the boy deserved more than a life of limping through childhood. Inside, Grace set the table, glancing toward the patio window. She saw Ethan sitting with Danny and felt a cautious warmth in her chest. It wasn't that she trusted him fully yet. Life had taught her to be wary. But she saw something in Ethan's posture, the way he leaned just enough to listen, the way Danny's usual guardedness softened in his presence. Later that night, Ethan lingered in the kitchen after dinner, rinsing his plate while Grace dried the dishes. "He needs treatment," Ethan said quietly, almost to himself. Grace stiffened. "I know, but it's expensive." "We couldn't," her voice trailed off, heavy with resignation. Ethan didn't press further, not yet. Instead, he nodded, filing away the certainty that he would do something. He didn't want to frighten her with promises she wasn't ready to accept. But the thought stayed with him, clear and immovable, long after the house grew quiet. In the days that followed, their lives continued in the same delicate balance. Grace kept the home running smoothly. Danny began to laugh more, exploring the rooms as though they belonged to him, and Ethan adjusted to the background hum of family life. It was still formal, still restrained, but a foundation had been laid. For the first time in years, Ethan's house felt less like a polished museum and more like a place where people actually lived. He hadn't expected it, but when he walked through the door each evening, the silence he once embraced was no longer there, and he found he didn't miss it at all. Late one evening, Ethan returned from the hospital and dropped his keys on the counter, expecting the usual quiet. Grace had already put Danny to bed, and the house was wrapped in a peaceful stillness. He had barely settled into his chair when his phone rang. The name flashing on the screen tugged at memories he hadn't revisited in years. Paul Kramer, an old classmate from high school. Ethan Caldwell. The familiar voice boomed as soon as he answered. Man, it's been forever. You still slicing people open for a living? Ethan chuckled. Cardiac surgery, Paul. Not as crude as you make it sound. Same difference, Paul teased. Listen, the old crew's putting together a reunion. 20 years since we graduated. We're all meeting next month. Everyone's bringing their spouses. You'll be there, right? The question was simple, casual, but it froze Ethan in place. Spouses, wives, husbands. He hesitated, pride colliding with truth. He should have just said he was single, but the words slipped out before he could stop himself. Of course, my wife, and I wouldn't miss it. There was silence on the other end for a beat, then Paul let out a laugh. You old dog, I didn't even know you tied the knot. Can't wait to meet her. Ethan forced a smile that no one could see. Yeah, she's great. After the call ended, Ethan set the phone down and cursed under his breath. Why had he said that? It was one thing to be single at 35, but among classmates who had all built families, he didn't want to stand there alone, the odd man out. Pride had spoken for him. Now he had to deal with it. The next morning, he caught sight of Grace wiping down the kitchen counters. Danny was at the table, bent over a coloring book. Ethan cleared his throat. Grace, can I talk to you for a moment? She looked up, immediately wary. Of course. Did I do something wrong? No, not at all. He gestured toward the study, and she followed, nervously smoothing her apron as she sat on the edge of a chair. Ethan remained standing, hands shoved into his pockets. I received a call last night. There's a reunion for my old class. Everyone will be bringing their spouses. I may have told them I was married. Grace blinked. You told them what? He exhaled. It just slipped out, and now they're expecting me to show up with a wife. I was wondering if you would be willing to play the part, just for one evening. Her eyes widened, and she almost laughed at the absurdity. You want me to pretend to be your wife? Yes, Ethan admitted. I'll compensate you, of course. You wouldn't have to do much. Just stand by my side, smile, exchange pleasantries. Then it's over. No one there will ever see you again. Grace folded her arms, shaking her head. Ethan, that's crazy. What if people see through it? I'm not. She stopped herself, biting down on the words. Not sophisticated. Not polished enough. That was what she almost said. I'll make sure no one does, he promised quickly. I'll provide a dress, take you to a salon. You won't have to worry about a thing. I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important. Grace looked down at her hands. Danny needed stability, and she owed Ethan for giving them shelter. Still, the thought of pretending to be a man's wife, standing among strangers who belonged to his world, terrified her. And Danny, she asked, her voice soft. He'll be fine for a few hours, Ethan said. I'll arrange for someone trustworthy to stay with him. It's only one night. The silence stretched until finally, with a resigned sigh, Grace nodded. All right, I'll do it, but only because I don't want to make things worse for you. Relief washed over Ethan's face. Thank you. Truly. True to his word, the next week he returned home carrying a box from a boutique. Inside lay a gown the color of clear summer skies, its fabric threaded with subtle shimmer. Grace hesitated before lifting it from the tissue paper, her fingers trembling as she held it against herself. It's too much, she whispered. It's perfect, Ethan corrected, his eyes warm with approval. Wait until you see it on. On the evening of the reunion, he drove her to one of Houston's finest salons. Grace sat in the chair, stiff with nerves, while stylists worked their magic. Her hair was pinned into an elegant updo, makeup brushed in soft tones that highlighted her natural features. When she finally stepped out of the salon toward the car, Ethan was waiting by the curb. For a man who prided himself on composure, he forgot himself for a moment. His jaw slackened, and his eyes widened as though he were seeing her for the first time. Grace flushed under his gaze, gripping the folds of her gown. "What?" she asked nervously. He shook his head, a slow smile spreading. "Nothing. Just you look incredible." For Grace, who had lived years feeling invisible, the words sank deep. She barely recognized the woman staring back at her in the salon mirror. Refined, luminous, nothing like the exhausted mother who had once huddled on a bench outside a supermarket. And though she told herself it was all pretense, that this night would mean nothing more, a quiet part of her couldn't help but wonder if this transformation might be more than just skin deep. The banquet hall glittered with chandeliers and soft music, the kind of venue Ethan's classmates had chosen to remind each other how far they had come since high school. Men wore tailored suits, women dressed in elegant gowns, and conversations hummed with stories of careers, families, and vacations abroad. When Ethan entered with Grace on his arm, the atmosphere shifted. Heads turned. Conversations faltered. For a moment, it was as though the entire room inhaled at once. Grace, draped in the sapphire gown and glowing from the careful touch of the stylists, seemed like someone who had always belonged in such a place. Her posture was nervous, her fingers tightening around Ethan's arm. But to everyone else, she looked like elegance personified. "Ethan Caldwell," Paul Kramer boomed, striding over with a wide grin. "And this must be your wife." His eyes lingered a second too long on Grace before he pulled Ethan into a hearty embrace. "This is Grace," Ethan said smoothly, his voice carrying quiet pride. He hadn't realized until that moment how natural it felt to introduce her that way. Grace smiled politely, offering a soft handshake. Compliments rained down almost immediately. "She's stunning." "Where have you been hiding her, Ethan?" "You always had good taste." The wives of his classmates exchanged glances, some smiling politely, others whispering with thinly veiled envy. Grace felt the weight of their eyes and flushed, lowering her gaze. She wasn't used to attention, let alone admiration. She had walked into this night expecting to be painfully out of place. Instead, she was the one being noticed. Ethan guided her through the crowd with ease, introducing her to old friends and colleagues, each introduction reinforcing the illusion. But even to him, it didn't feel entirely like pretense anymore. There was a warmth in his chest when he caught her laughing shyly at a compliment, or when he noticed how the light caught in her hair. He hadn't expected this night to feel real, but it did. Later, as the band struck up a familiar tune, Paul clapped Ethan on the back. "You've got to dance with her. Don't keep her sitting here while the rest of us make fools of ourselves." Ethan turned to Grace, offering his hand. "May I?" She hesitated, glancing at the couples already swaying across the polished floor. "I'm not much of a dancer." "Neither am I," Ethan replied with a small smile. "But no one here will notice." Grace allowed him to lead her to the dance floor. His hand rested lightly at her waist, her fingers tentatively clasping his shoulder. At first, her movements were stiff, self-conscious, but Ethan's steady presence anchored her. He moved with calm assurance, guiding her gently until she found the rhythm. Slowly, her nerves gave way to something unexpected, comfort. As they turned beneath the golden lights, Grace lifted her eyes to his and found him already watching her. It wasn't the practiced gaze of a man showing off his partner for social points. It was softer, more searching, as though he was trying to memorize the way she looked at that very moment. Heat rose in her cheeks, and she looked away quickly, but the flutter in her chest lingered. Around them, whispers floated through the air. Caldwell really outdid himself. "She's beautiful." I didn't know he had it in him. The admiration only intensified Grace's unease. But beneath it all, she felt a flicker of pride. For once, she wasn't the struggling woman scraping by, invisible to the world. She was someone people noticed, someone who belonged at the side of a man like Ethan. When the music slowed, Ethan leaned close, his voice low. "You're doing wonderfully." Grace laughed softly, her nerves spilling out as humor. "For someone who's supposed to be pretending, you sound awfully convincing." His lips curved, maybe because it doesn't feel like pretending. She froze, her heart tripping over itself. It was just a line, she told herself, just a way to keep up appearances. Yet when she dared to meet his gaze again, she saw no calculation there, only sincerity. And that unsettled her more than anything. The song ended, and applause rippled through the room. Ethan guided her back to their table, his hand lingering at the small of her back a moment longer than necessary. Grace sat down, flustered, but a shy smile tugged at her lips. She had stepped into this night expecting nothing but awkwardness, a role to play until the charade was over. Instead, she felt a spark, something fragile, something dangerous, something real. And though neither of them knew it yet, this fragile spark would be the first step toward truths that could no longer stay hidden. The morning after the reunion, Paul insisted on giving Ethan and Grace a short tour of the school before they left. It was partly nostalgia, partly pride, and eagerness to show how the old building had been preserved. Grace followed beside Ethan, still in awe of the evening before, her hand brushing lightly against the sleeve of his jacket. She had expected ridicule, but had received admiration instead. For a fleeting night, she had felt transformed. The halls of the school carried the faint scent of polished wood and old paper. Posters of graduating classes lined the walls, photographs of smiling faces framed in glass. Grace's pace slowed as her eyes wandered across the images. Each year seemed a frozen moment in time, familiar yet distant. Then she stopped abruptly. Her breath caught, and she pressed a hand to her mouth. On a memorial board dedicated to students who had passed too young, a face stared back at her. One she could never forget. Laura Miller, her sister. Tears sprang instantly to Grace's eyes. Her chest tightened as if the air had been stolen from the hallway. "Laura!" she whispered, the name breaking on her lips. Ethan turned, alarmed by the sudden change in her voice. He followed her gaze to the photograph. A young woman, smiling gently, framed by flowers and a small plaque that marked her death at 22. His heart lurched violently, his stomach hollowing as recognition struck him like a blow. Laura. The name echoed in his mind, pulling him back to a summer years ago. A fishing trip at a quiet lake outside the city. She had been there, bright, full of laughter, eyes sparkling in the sun as she teased him about his poor casting technique. They had spent days talking, walking the banks of the water, sharing stories like old friends though they had just met. Their connection had been sudden, fierce, unforgettable. He had left that trip convinced he would see her again. But life, residency, and distance had pulled him away. He had never sought her out, telling himself that fate would bring them together if it was meant to be. And now, fate had shown him her face again on a memorial board. He stood frozen, his throat thick, his pulse hammering in his ears. Grace sobbed quietly, her shoulders trembling as she traced her sister's name on the plaque. "She died during childbirth," she choked out. "She didn't make it. I promised I'd take care of her baby. Danny. He's mine now, but really he's hers." Danny. The name thundered in Ethan's mind. His vision blurred as pieces slammed into place with terrifying clarity. Laura. That summer. The brief but undeniable intimacy they had shared. The timing of her pregnancy. Danny. Ethan swayed, his hands curling into fists at his sides. Could it be possible? Could the boy who laughed in his home, who limped through the halls with stubborn bravery, be his son? He forced himself to breathe, to hide the storm ripping through him. Grace was still crying, oblivious to the turmoil inside him. He stepped closer, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. I'm so sorry, Grace, he murmured, his voice raw. I didn't know. She shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. No one could have known. I was there when she passed. I was the only one left to care for him. I didn't want him to end up in foster care, so I raised him as my own. It hasn't been easy, but he's all I have. Ethan swallowed hard, fighting to keep his composure. He wanted to speak, to confess the memories flooding him, but the words tangled in his throat. How could he tell her? How could he explain that her sister's child might not just be her responsibility, but his own flesh and blood? They left the school soon after, Grace leaning into Ethan's quiet support, her grief raw and unguarded. He walked beside her in silence, each step heavy with revelation. His mind reeled, torn between shock and guilt. He had let Laura slip away once, never realizing what was lost. Now, standing in the shadow of her death, he faced the unthinkable possibility that her child, Grace's son, was his. That night, long after Grace had gone to bed and the house had grown silent, Ethan sat alone in his study. His hands trembled as he pressed them together, his thoughts circling relentlessly. Danny's face rose in his mind, his smile, his stubborn courage, his fragile leg that needed healing. The resemblance he had dismissed before now haunted him. The truth loomed over him, undeniable and terrifying. Danny Miller might be his son, and Ethan Caldwell, the man who had spent his life mastering control, suddenly felt as though the ground beneath him had given way. The drive back from the school was heavy with silence. Grace sat in the passenger seat, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, still shaken from the shock of seeing Laura's face on the memorial wall. Her eyes were red, her cheeks streaked with tears she hadn't yet managed to wipe away. Ethan kept his eyes fixed on the road, but his knuckles whitened against the steering wheel. Every mile brought him closer to a decision he knew he couldn't postpone. At last, unable to bear the weight pressing down on him, he spoke. "Grace," he began, his voice low and unsteady. "There's something I need to tell you." She turned slightly, her face guarded. "What is it?" He drew a slow breath, searching for words that could carry the truth without crushing her. "Years ago, before residency consumed my life, I took a trip outside the city. I went fishing by a lake not far from here, and I met someone. Her name was Laura." His voice faltered on the name. "She was unforgettable. We spent a few days together, talking, laughing, sitting by the water. It was brief, but it felt real." Grace's lips parted, her expression caught between disbelief and pain. "I thought about her afterward," Ethan continued, his throat tight, "but then work pulled me back. I told myself it had only been a fleeting thing. I didn't look for her. I should have. God, I should have. And now," his hands trembled as they tightened on the wheel, "now I know the woman I left behind was your sister." The car felt suddenly smaller, suffocating. Grace shook her head, slowly, tears spilling anew. "So all this time, Danny," Ethan forced himself to meet her gaze for a moment before turning back to the road. "I don't know for certain, but if Laura was pregnant after that summer, if the timing fits, then yes, it's possible he's mine." Her breath hitched as she turned away, staring out the window at the blur of passing lights. "Do you have any idea what you're saying? For years, I've carried him as my own, fought for him when no one else would. And now you're telling me he might be your son." The anguish in her voice pierced him. "I don't want to take him from you," Ethan said quickly. "You've been his mother in every way that matters. I would never try to erase that. But if he's my son, Grace, don't I owe him the truth? Don't I owe him the chance at a future with every resource I can give?" Her shoulders shook, torn between fury and despair. "You don't get it. For me, Danny is more than responsibility. He's everything. He's all I have left of Laura. If this is true, if he's yours, what happens then? Where does that leave me?" Ethan slowed the car, pulling over to the side of the road. He turned to her fully, his eyes raw with emotion. It leaves you where you've always been, at the center of his life. Nothing changes that. But I can't walk away, Grace. Not now. Not knowing what I know. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Only the hum of the engine and Grace's uneven breathing filled the air. At last, she whispered, "How can we even be sure?" "There's a way," Ethan said firmly. "A DNA test. Simple, conclusive. No guessing. If Danny is mine, we'll know." Grace hesitated, the thought almost too much to bear. But deep inside, she knew the boy deserved the truth, however painful it might be. After a long silence, she nodded faintly. "Then do it. But promise me, no matter what the result says, you won't take him away from me." Ethan's voice broke as he answered, "I swear, Grace, I would never do that." The following week passed in a haze. Ethan arranged for the test quietly, ensuring it was done with discretion. Grace carried herself with the weight of dread, torn between hope and fear. Danny, blissfully unaware, continued with his drawings and small joys, limping through the house with determination. When the results finally arrived, Ethan opened the envelope alone, his breath shallow, his heart pounding as though he were about to perform the most delicate surgery of his life. One glance at the paper told him everything. Probability of paternity, 99.9%. His knees went weak, and he sank into a chair, the document shaking in his hands. Danny was his son, flesh of his flesh, a bond that could no longer be denied. Later, when he showed Grace the results, she pressed the paper against her chest and sobbed. The truth was undeniable, the revelation both devastating and illuminating. For Ethan, it was a second chance he had never expected. For Grace, it was the confirmation of a truth that changed everything. And yet, strangely, nothing at all. Danny was still her boy, but now he was Ethan's too. And in that tangled truth, the fragile hope of a new beginning flickered to life. The DNA results changed everything, and yet changed nothing. Danny was still the boy who filled the house with sketches and laughter, still the child Grace had raised since the day Laura died. But now Ethan saw him through a different lens, no longer just Grace's nephew, but his son. The knowledge struck him with equal parts awe and guilt, a reminder of what he had missed and what he could not afford to lose again. One evening, after Danny had gone to bed, Ethan found Grace in the kitchen rinsing dishes. Her shoulders were tense, her movements brisk, as if the steady rhythm of cleaning could keep her from unraveling. He stepped closer, voice quiet. "Grace, I've spoken with colleagues. Danny's leg can be repaired. It'll take surgery and physical therapy, but he could walk without pain. Run. Play like other boys. I want to cover all of it, the surgery, the recovery, everything." Grace's hands stilled in the sink. She looked over her shoulder, eyes wide and conflicted. "Ethan, that's too much. I can't let you do that." "You can," he countered gently, "and you should. He's my responsibility now, too. I can give him what he needs." Her lips trembled as she turned back to the sink. "I'm grateful. You don't know how much. But this isn't just about money or medicine. This is about him, about us. Things are complicated enough already. I don't want him caught in a tug of war." Ethan stepped closer, his voice firmer. "There won't be a tug of war. You've raised him. You've given him everything you could. That doesn't change. But Grace, he deserves more than what life has handed him so far. And I can give it to him. Please let me." The sincerity in his tone softened something in her, but the walls she had built around herself remained. Grace nodded faintly, as though agreeing only because fighting further would break her. "We'll see," she whispered. Days blurred into weeks. Preparations began for Danny's procedure, consultations scheduled, forms signed. Ethan handled the logistics with the precision of a surgeon and the urgency of a father. Grace helped, but with each passing day she seemed more withdrawn, weighed down by unspoken thoughts. Then came the night that shifted everything. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that pressed against the walls. Grace stood by the window in her room, staring out at the Houston skyline, its lights glittering against the dark. Ethan knocked softly before stepping inside. He meant only to reassure her, to remind her she wasn't alone in this. But when their eyes met, something fragile cracked open between them. She whispered, "Laura should be here, not me. She should be the one raising him. Every time I look at Danny, I see her face. And now you." Her voice broke, thick with guilt. "How can I not feel like I've stolen something from her?" Ethan crossed the room, stopping just close enough for her to feel his presence. "Grace, you didn't steal him. You saved him. Without you, Danny wouldn't have survived. You carried him through when no one else could. Laura would have wanted that." Her eyes filled with tears, and before either of them could think, the distance closed. His hand brushed her cheek, her breath caught, and then his lips found hers in a kiss that was hesitant, searching, filled with years of loneliness and suppressed longing. For a fleeting moment, Grace let herself lean into it, let herself feel what it meant to be wanted, not as a caretaker, not as a shadow of her sister, but as herself. But when the kiss broke, reality crashed down. She stepped back quickly, pressing her hands to her mouth. "I can't," she whispered. "I can't do this. Not with you. Not with her memory between us." "Grace," Ethan began, but she shook her head, tears spilling. "I need to leave," she said, her voice trembling. "I can't let this turn into something it shouldn't be." He caught her hand before she could pull away. "If you leave, that won't change what's already true. Danny is my son, and whether you're here or not, I will be there for him. I won't walk away again. Not from him. Not from you." The determination in his voice held her frozen. She saw no hesitation in his eyes, no fear, only conviction. Slowly, she sank into a chair, her body trembling from the clash of guilt and longing. Ethan knelt before her, his hand still holding hers. "We'll figure this out," he said softly, "even if it takes time, even if it hurts. But I'm not letting go of either of you." In that moment, Grace realized that what frightened her most wasn't Ethan's resolve. It was the part of her heart that wanted to believe him. Danny's surgery was scheduled at Houston Methodist, the same hospital where Ethan's reputation carried weight in every corridor. On the morning of the procedure, Grace sat at her son's bedside, clutching his hand as nurses prepared him. Ethan moved with calm authority, reassuring both of them even though his heart pounded harder than it ever had before any operation of his own. The hours stretched endlessly. Grace paced the waiting room, whispering prayers under her breath, while Ethan stood beside her, every muscle taut with restrained anxiety. Finally, the doors opened, and the lead surgeon, one of Ethan's trusted colleagues, approached with a smile. "The operation was a success. He'll need physical therapy, but your boy's going to walk without pain." Grace broke down in tears of relief, pressing her hands to her face. Ethan wrapped an arm around her shoulders, steadying her as her body trembled. For the first time, she didn't pull away. The days that followed were filled with small victories. Danny took his first steps with the help of crutches, his face scrunched in determination as Grace and Ethan encouraged him. Each day, he grew stronger, pushing through the exercises with a resilience that filled Ethan with pride. They clapped and cheered when Danny managed a few steps unaided, and the boys' laughter echoed through the rehabilitation room like sunlight breaking through clouds. It was during one of those evenings, when Danny had finally fallen asleep after a long day of therapy, that Ethan found Grace on the patio, her face lifted to the warm Houston night. He stepped beside her, the quiet between them charged with all that had passed. "Grace," he said softly, "I need to tell you something I can't keep inside any longer." She turned, her eyes wary but open. "I don't just want to be part of Danny's life," Ethan continued. "I want to be part of yours. These weeks, they've shown me something I didn't know I was missing. A family, a home. You and Danny, You filled this house with something I can't imagine living without. I love you, Grace. I want us to build a life together, not out of obligation, but because I choose you." Grace's lips parted, her breath catching. The confession struck deep, awakening both longing and fear. "Ethan," she whispered, "I don't know if I can. It feels wrong sometimes, as if I'm betraying Laura's memory. She should have been here with you, not me." Ethan took her hands gently in his. "Laura is gone, and nothing can change that. But she left us Danny, and you carried him when no one else could. You gave him love, a home, everything. That doesn't diminish her memory, it honors it. And I know if she could see us now, she would be grateful for you. For us." Tears filled Grace's eyes, but this time they weren't only of sorrow. She let herself lean into his embrace, and for the first time, she didn't resist the warmth she felt there. Weeks later, when Danny had regained enough strength, Ethan decided it was time to take the next step. He invited Grace and Danny to meet his parents, two people who had once been distant in his life, but who had always respected his choices. They gathered at his parents' home, a stately brick house in one of Houston's quieter suburbs. Grace was visibly nervous, smoothing her dress again and again, but Ethan kept a reassuring hand at her back. When they walked in, his mother's eyes lit up. "So this is Grace and Danny. Welcome." His father, reserved but kind, shook her hand firmly and bent down to greet Danny with a smile. The evening unfolded with surprising warmth. Grace relaxed as Ethan's mother complimented her cooking when she described the meal she prepared, and his father praised Danny's courage in therapy. Laughter filled the dining room, weaving the threads of something that felt like belonging. It was near the end of dinner, with everyone gathered around the table, that Ethan stood. He cleared his throat, nerves visible even in his composed demeanor. Grace looked up, startled, as he reached into his pocket and drew out a small velvet box. "Grace," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "from the moment you and Danny came into my life, everything changed. You gave me more than companionship. You gave me a family. I don't want to imagine a future without you by my side. Will you marry me?" Grace gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. The room fell into hushed silence, eyes shining with anticipation. Danny leaned forward, his grin wide and hopeful. For a long, trembling second, Grace couldn't find her voice. Then tears spilled down her cheeks as she whispered, "Yes, yes, Ethan, I will." Applause and cheers erupted around the table. Ethan slipped the ring onto her finger, and Grace let herself fall into his arms, her heart pounding with a mixture of relief and joy. Danny wrapped his arms around them both, laughing through his own tears. For the first time in years, Grace felt the weight of grief lifting. What had begun as an arrangement born of chance had blossomed into something neither of them had expected. A true family. The wedding was nothing extravagant, just as Grace had wished. They chose a small chapel on the outskirts of Houston, where the stained glass windows glowed with afternoon light and the air was filled with the fragrance of lilies. Friends, colleagues, and family gathered, not hundreds, but enough to make the room feel alive with warmth. Grace walked down the aisle in a simple ivory dress, her hand trembling slightly until her eyes found Ethan waiting at the altar. His gaze held steady, filled with a love that had taken root in the most unexpected of circumstances. Danny sat in the front pew, his face glowing with pride. When the vows were spoken and the rings exchanged, he was the first to clap, his voice ringing out above the rest. "That's my dad," he cried, his smile so wide it lit up the entire chapel. The laughter and applause that followed made Grace's tears spill freely. Ethan knelt down in front of Danny and opened his arms, and the boy ran to him without hesitation. For the first time, Danny called him Dad, not in practice or pretense, but with joy and certainty. The reception was modest but joyful. Tables laid with homemade dishes, music that encouraged even the most reserved guests to dance, and laughter that spilled long into the evening. Grace felt as though she were floating, the girl who had once huddled on a cold bench outside a supermarket, now standing in the center of a life she never thought possible. Weeks later, Ethan kept his promise of a honeymoon, taking Grace to Paris. It wasn't about luxury or spectacle. It was about standing on cobblestone streets together, hand in hand, looking out over the Seine at night while the Eiffel Tower shimmered against the sky. For Ethan, the city was a symbol of starting over, of savoring each moment instead of letting life slip past in the blur of long hours and empty rooms. For Grace, Paris was proof that she belonged in a world she had once thought forever closed to her. They strolled through art galleries, shared quiet meals in sidewalk cafes, and let themselves breathe in the rhythm of a city built on beauty and resilience. On their final night, as they sat watching the lights flicker across the river, Grace leaned her head against Ethan's shoulder. "I never thought happiness could look like this," she whispered. "It's only the beginning," Ethan said, his hand resting protectively over hers. When they returned to Houston, life unfolded with even more joy. Grace discovered she was pregnant. The news came quietly, an appointment, a smile from the doctor, a slip of paper confirming what she already suspected. She shared it with Ethan one evening at home, slipping the test results across the table with nervous hands. He read them, blinked, and then looked up with a grin that broke into unrestrained laughter. He stood, lifting her into his arms, twirling her around the kitchen like a man who had just been given the world. Danny burst into the room at the commotion, and when they told him he was going to be a big brother, he jumped with delight. "A sister!" he exclaimed, already imagining the role. The months passed in a blur of preparations, nursery colors, tiny clothes, doctor's visits. Grace carried the baby with the kind of peace she had never known before, supported every step by Ethan and cheered on by Danny, who took his job as protector very seriously. But amidst the joy, there was one more thing to be done. On a cool autumn morning, Ethan, Grace, and Danny drove to the cemetery where Laura rested. Grace carried a bouquet of fresh lilies, Danny a small bundle of wildflowers he had picked himself. They stood together before the simple headstone, the silence heavy but not unbearable. Grace knelt, placing the flowers gently at her sister's grave. Her voice trembled as she whispered, "I kept my promise, Laura. He's safe. He's loved. And now we're building a family that will carry you with us always." Ethan rested his hand on Grace's shoulder, his other hand holding Danny's. The boy looked up at the stone, then at the two adults who now stood as his parents, and whispered, "Thank you, Aunt Laura." The three of them stood together in that moment, bound by grief but also by love. The past had taken much from them, loss, loneliness, years they could never reclaim. But it had also led them here, to each other, to a future that glowed with promise. As they turned to leave, Grace slipped her hand into Ethan's.
The world keeps turning, and with each turn comes a new story. When one door closes, another opens, leading us into a journey entirely different. Let us set aside the echoes of the tale just past and step together into a new realm where another destiny awaits to be told. And now I invite you to listen to the second story, a path of its own, unrelated to what came before, yet filled with mysteries and surprises meant only for those willing to journey onward with me.
I woke up to the sound of rain hammering the rusted sheet metal above my head. Cold air slipped in through the warped window frame, cutting straight to the bone. My breath hung in the air like pale smoke as I pushed aside the thin blanket, its edges stiff with age. The makeshift stove in the corner had long since gone cold, and the damp smell of the night still clung to everything inside. I reached for the half-empty plastic bottle beside my bed, splashed some water onto my face, and rubbed away the grit of another sleepless night. Breakfast was a stale crust of bread I'd saved from yesterday, and a few sips of lukewarm tea that had lost any hint of flavor hours ago. It didn't matter. I'd eaten worse, much worse. I pulled on my old windbreaker, its zipper stuck halfway up, and stepped outside. The muddy lot stretched toward the distant hum of Tacoma's industrial docks, where the air smelled faintly of salt and diesel. The clouds were low, heavy, pressing down on the city. My boots sank into the wet ground with each step as I made my way toward the waterfront dump. I had one prayer on my lips. Please, just let me find enough cardboard or bottles today. Enough for a piece of bread, maybe a hot cup of coffee if I was lucky. By the time I got there, the others were already picking through the piles. Alex Gizmo Morales was crouched near an old refrigerator, his fingers working like he was fixing something that would never work again. A couple of men I only knew by their street names, Crab and Sour, were tearing open bags without looking up. I greeted them softly. Good morning, Alex. Gentlemen. They barely nodded, trading glances as if I'd just spoken a foreign language. She's not like us, I overheard one of them mutter. Talks like she's still living in some rich neighborhood. What's she even doing here? I pretended not to hear. I'd learned that silence was safer than trying to explain. They called me schoolteacher because I wore glasses and spoke in full sentences. I didn't smoke, didn't drink, and I never begged on street corners. That alone made me an outsider even here, among people who'd lost everything. Truth be told, I didn't belong anywhere anymore. So I kept my eyes down, bent to my work, and let the rain run down the back of my neck. The morning wore on, the rain easing to a fine mist that clung to my hair and jacket. The dump was quieter now, just the steady rustle of plastic and the occasional clang of metal as someone overturned a bin. I worked my way deeper into the piles, past broken furniture and mountains of soaked cardboard. My fingers were numb, but I kept going. I'd learned to ignore the smell years ago, until a sharp, faint sound cut through the background noise. It was a high-pitched chirp, barely there, coming from somewhere behind a collapsed mound of bricks and splintered wood. For a second, my chest tightened. More than once, I'd found kittens tossed into bags, tied shut like garbage. People could be cruel in ways that never stopped surprising me. I'd seen those bags before. Sometimes we got there in time, sometimes we didn't. I set down my sack of bottles and picked my way over the debris. The sound came again, sharper this time. I pulled away a piece of sheetrock and my breath caught. No kittens, no living thing at all. Lying in the dirt was a smartphone, its screen dark except for the small icon of a nearly dead battery blinking in the corner. I glanced around quickly. Gizmo was still hunched over his scrap pile, and Crab and Sour were arguing about a torn jacket. No one had seen. Without thinking, I slipped the phone into my pocket, its weight oddly heavy against my hip, and went back to pretending to dig through trash for another half hour, just enough to keep anyone from wondering why I'd left so soon. When I finally walked away, the sack over my shoulder held enough bottles for a cup of tea and maybe a roll from the bakery on 6th. But I wasn't heading straight back to my shack. Instead, I turned toward the old heating tunnels near the freight yard, where Gizmo sometimes set up camp. "Afternoon, Alex," I called as I ducked inside. He looked up, his dark hair sticking up in every direction. "Think you could help me out? I found this, but the charger's missing." I held up the phone. His eyes narrowed for a second. He wasn't stupid. A phone like this didn't belong in my hands unless it was stolen or found. But he just shrugged. "Yeah, I've got something that'll work. You owe me, though." I emptied the coins from my pocket into his palm without arguing. A deal was a deal. As the phone began to take a slow charge, I headed back toward my shack, the thought of what might be on it pressing harder with every step. That night, I lit the stove and boiled the small pile of potatoes I'd found in a discarded crate. The phone sat on the crate I used as a table, screen glowing faintly. When the charging light finally turned green, I hesitated, my hand hovering over it. No passcode, no lock. The home screen was almost empty, no photos, no messages, just a few folders. I opened one at random, and that was when the air seemed to leave the room. There he was, Victor Ellison, my husband, the man I'd been told was dead, standing alive, healthy, smiling in a tuxedo beside a young woman in a wedding gown. And the date at the bottom of the screen was last month. I felt my knees weaken, the world tilting under me. My husband hadn't been murdered. He'd been living, celebrating, starting over, while I rotted away in prison for his death. And in that moment, the cold inside me turned into something else entirely. Before the streets, before the dump, before the smell of damp cardboard clung to my clothes, I was somebody. I was Martha Ellison, daughter of Raymond Ellison, the man who built Ellison Couture from a single tailor shop into one of Seattle's most sought-after fashion houses. My childhood was all glass and light. Weekend trips to the San Juan Islands, piano lessons in a sunlit room, private schools where every hallway smelled faintly of polished wood and perfume. My mother, Julia, was gentle but unyielding when it came to manners. My father was stricter still, insisting I work twice as hard as anyone else, because Ellison meant something, or it used to. When I left for university, there was never a thought of a dorm room. My parents bought me a small, airy condo downtown, with floor-to-ceiling windows and a balcony that overlooked Elliott Bay. I studied languages, dreaming of becoming an interpreter, someone who could move effortlessly between worlds. My father approved. He liked the idea of a career that was both sophisticated and profitable. Even then, I kept to myself. I didn't go to parties, didn't drink, didn't smoke. I wasn't shy exactly, just unwilling to waste time on things that felt empty. My glasses and my serious manner made me the quiet girl in every room. That never bothered me until Victor. We met at a fashion show in the city, one of those events where champagne flowed like water and every seat was occupied by someone in the business. I was there on behalf of my father's company, studying the latest designs, taking notes. Victor was introduced as a promising new designer, tall, well-dressed, the kind of smile that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. "Would you care to join me for dinner?" he'd asked, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I surprised myself by saying yes. That night, we ate oysters and pasta in a quiet corner of an Italian restaurant while a jazz trio played in the background. Victor listened, really listened, leaning forward as I spoke. He made me feel seen in a way no one had before. By the end of the night, when he kissed my hand and said, "I hope we meet again," I was already wondering how soon that could be. It didn't take long. Flowers began arriving at my office. Handwritten notes, each one a little more personal. By the third week, he sent a basket of deep red roses with a card. "To the most captivating woman in Seattle, Saturday at 8, same place." I didn't even hesitate. We fell fast. And when he proposed, down on one knee in front of a small crowd at the Space Needles restaurant, I said yes without a flicker of doubt. Victor took my name, something that felt like a romantic gesture at the time. "Ellison should live on," he told me. "Our children will carry it proudly." My parents adored him, or at least they pretended to. For a while, married life was every bit the dream I thought it would be. Candlelit dinners, weekend getaways to Vancouver, whispered "I love yous" in the dark. I believed in it. I believed in him. But fairy tales never last. It started small, so small I almost convinced myself I was imagining it. 2 years into our marriage, the house felt colder, not because of the weather, but because of the distance growing between us. We'd been trying for a child since our honeymoon, but month after month, nothing. At first, Victor brushed it off with a smile, telling me not to stress, that it would happen when it happened. But as the months turned into years, the smile faded. His mother, Helen, began making comments over Sunday dinners. Half jokes that cut sharper than any blade. "I just hope I'm still around to see a grandchild, Victor. Some women have issues, you know." Victor never defended me. Sometimes he added to the sting, shrugging and saying, "Maybe she's just too focused on work." It was easier to bite my tongue than start another fight. Then there were the late nights, the smell of perfume that wasn't mine lingering on his shirt, the vague stories about meetings that ran over, or old friends he'd run into. I wanted to believe him, so I did until I couldn't. One evening, I asked him directly if there was someone else. He laughed, actually laughed, as if I'd told him a bad joke. "You're imagining things, Martha. Your wound too tight." That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening for the sound of his breathing beside me. I never heard it. The breaking point came a few weeks later. We were sitting in the living room with Helen, and the words just spilled out of me. If you don't love me anymore, Victor, then we should get divorced. I'm not going to live like this. Silence. His eyes narrowed. Helen's mouth tightened into a thin line. Martha, she said sweetly, Victor adores you. He's just under stress. This talk of divorce is rash. I turned to her, my voice sharper than I intended. Your son's been under stress for 2 years. He doesn't work, he drinks more than he should, and I'm tired of pretending otherwise. Victor didn't speak. He just watched me, and in his eyes I saw something I couldn't name then, but recognized now: calculation. 2 nights later, he came home early with flowers, my favorite wine, and a smile that felt rehearsed. I've been thinking, he said, we should start over. Just you and me. No more fighting. He opened a bottle of champagne, poured 2 glasses, and held one out to me. I remember the cool stem of the glass in my hand, the soft pop of bubbles against my tongue, and then nothing. Just darkness. When I woke, there was pounding on the front door. My head felt heavy, my limbs like sandbags. The voices outside were sharp, official. I stumbled to the door, pulling it open to find 2 police officers, a handful of neighbors, and Helen standing behind them, her face twisted in outrage. Mrs. Ellison, one officer said, we have reason to believe you may be involved in the death of your husband. May we come in? I laughed a raw, broken sound, because how could something so absurd be real? But they pushed past me, moving straight toward the bedroom. Helen's voice rose behind them. I told you she was unstable. Look at the blood. There was blood. On the sheets, on the carpet. A knife, wrapped in one of our bed linens, tucked into my dresser drawer. The room spun. I tried to speak, to explain, but the words tangled in my throat. Cold metal bit into my wrists. The last thing I saw as they led me away was Helen's satisfied smile. County jail was just the waiting room. The real punishment began the moment the gates clanged shut behind me at the women's correctional facility. The air inside was thick, stale, with the faint tang of bleach that never masked the scent of too many bodies in too small a space. My cell was a concrete box with 4 bunks, 3 women already sprawled on them, eyes flicking toward me like a pack sizing up fresh prey. I'd never lived with strangers before, never shared a bathroom, never heard the sound of keys jangling at every turn. In those first days, I barely spoke, barely ate. I lay on my side, facing the wall, holding myself together 1 breath at a time. It didn't take long for the taunts to start. Hey, school teacher, one woman called from across the cell. What's your story? Who'd you kill? When I didn't answer, the tone shifted, sharper, meaner. Too good to talk to us? Think you're better. One afternoon, a woman named Rena dropped down from the top bunk and came right at me, her shadow swallowing the light. Let's see how long you last in here, princess. Before she could lay a hand on me, a voice cut through the tension. Back off, Rena. It came from a tall, broad-shouldered woman in her 40s, with eyes that could stop you mid-breath. She's under my watch now. That was Donna Harris. Donna had been inside longer than most, long enough to know the rules that didn't make it into the handbook. She sat me down on my first real night there and spelled it out. You want to survive? You pick a reason to keep breathing. Could be revenge. Could be proving them wrong. But you pick it, and you hold on to it like it's the only thing you've got. And you never, never start snitching for favors. That's a death sentence in here. She taught me more than how to keep my head down. Donna had a kind of rough grace, a way of navigating the undercurrent of threats and alliances. She showed me how to stand my ground without starting a fight, how to make myself useful so I wasn't seen as dead weight. My hands found work at the sewing tables, hemming uniforms, repairing torn laundry bags. It was menial, but it was something I could control. Over time, the walls stopped feeling like they were closing in every hour of the day. I still woke in the night, heart racing, replaying that last evening with Victor. But instead of breaking me, those memories started to harden into something else. Not just grief, not just shame, resolve. I would survive this place. And one day, somehow, I would make them all answer for what they'd done to me. 6 years. That's how long it took for the sentence to end, though it felt like a lifetime had been carved out of me. When they finally handed back the few things I'd had the night I was arrested, a pair of earrings, my glasses, a jacket that no longer fit, I stepped outside the gates with no family waiting, no friends, no place to go. I took the bus back to Seattle, clutching the worn strap of my bag, my heart foolishly hoping I could at least see my home from the street. But when I reached the old address, there was no trace of my life left. A couple I'd never seen before opened the door. The woman held a coffee mug. The man barely looked at me. "You've got the wrong house," he said flatly, and when I tried to explain, he shut the door in my face. I begged them to let me take whatever might still be mine. A coat, a photo album, anything. They threatened to call the police if I didn't leave. The company was worse. Ellison Couture had been sold. New owners. New logo. The man in charge, some slick executive named Edward Harper, refused to see me. The security guard, someone who had once greeted me with a smile, looked right through me as if I'd never existed. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to step away from the building." I walked for hours that day until my feet ached, the drizzle soaking my hair flat against my head. By nightfall, I was just another figure under the overpass in Tacoma, wrapped in a blanket someone had left on a bench. I told myself it would only be temporary, a week, maybe 2, but weeks turned to months and months into a year. Then came the phone, the video, Victor alive, laughing, married to someone else. The fury that surged through me was like nothing I'd felt since the night I was arrested. It burned away the numbness I'd been living in, replaced by something sharp, dangerous. The next morning, I washed my hair in the sink at the shelter, pulled on the cleanest clothes I had, and walked straight to the police station. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my ears. At the front desk, a young officer barely glanced up as I explained why I was there. "So let me get this straight," he said, smirking. "Your dead husband's actually alive, and you've got proof on a phone you found? Lady, you expect me to believe that?" "I'm telling you the truth," I said, gripping the edge of the counter. "I was framed. I spent 6 years in prison for a murder that never happened." He leaned back in his chair. "Sounds like you just want a reward for turning in a phone." Tears burned my eyes, but I held my ground. I don't drink. I don't lie. And I'm not leaving until someone listens. That was when I heard a deeper voice behind me. "What's going on here?" I turned to see a tall man with close-cropped hair and a face marked by a thin scar running from his cheekbone to his jaw. His eyes were sharp but not unkind. The desk officer waved a hand. "She's spinning some story about her husband coming back from the dead." The man stepped closer, studying me like he could see past the dirt under my nails, past the fraying edges of my jacket. "Ma'am," he said, "come with me. Let's hear it all from the beginning." That was how I met Detective Stephen Carter. Stephen Carter wasn't the kind of man who wasted words. In his office, he closed the door, sat across from me, and said, "Start at the beginning. Don't leave anything out." I told him everything. My marriage to Victor, the night I blacked out, waking to police at my door, the trial, prison, the dump, and finally the video on the phone. When I was done, I slid the phone across his desk. "It's all there. Date stamp and everything." He watched the clip twice, his expression hardening. "You're saying you served 6 years for murdering this man," he said slowly, "and he's walking around free?" "Yes," I whispered, "and marrying someone else." Stephen leaned back, rubbing his jaw. "Leave the phone with me. I'll look into it. Where can I find you?" I hesitated, then gave him directions to the small shack I'd claimed near the industrial edge of Tacoma. He reached into his wallet and handed me a folded stack of bills. "Get something to eat, something warm, and stay put until you hear from me." For For the first time in years, I felt the smallest flicker of hope. Within days, Stephen had pulled my old case file and seen what I'd never been allowed to see. Contradictions, missing reports, statements from neighbors who all told the exact same story in the exact same words, too perfect to be real. And not one scrap of direct evidence that Victor was dead. He dug into Victor's trail and found him in Portland, Oregon, living under the name Victor Roman, preparing to marry Madison Blake, an heiress whose father had left her a trust fund. The pattern was textbook. Charm the woman, marry her, drain her, disappear. Stephen didn't tell me the details until much later. At the time, all I knew was he showed up one morning and said, "I'm going to see him. Alone. Shouldn't you have backup?" I asked. He shook his head. "If I go in with a team, he'll bolt. I need him to talk, and I need it on record. If I call you afterward, it means I need my guys to move in." I didn't like it, but I could see his mind was made up. The next thing I heard was 2 days later, a call from a clerk at the precinct telling me Stephen was in the hospital. I didn't ask questions, I just went. When I found his room, he was propped up against a stack of pillows, a bandage wrapped around his head. He looked at me and smiled like it was nothing. "It's fine," he said. "He just got in a lucky swing before I put him down." I stared at him. What happened? Stephen's voice was calm, but there was steel under it. "Your ex-husband tried to buy me off. When that didn't work, he tried to kill me. That's all I needed to bring him in." In that moment, I realized 2 things. Victor's luck had finally run out, and Stephen Carter was the first person in years who'd stood between me and the darkness. The day of the confrontation, Stephen insisted we make one stop first. "If we're going to face him, you're not walking in there looking like he left you," he said. I didn't argue. He took me to a friend of his, a stylist the department used for undercover work. An hour later, the woman staring back at me in the mirror was almost unrecognizable. My hair was freshly cut and colored, my makeup subtle but sharp, my glasses replaced with a sleek, modern pair. Stephen grinned. "Perfect. Let's go ruin his day." Victor was already seated in the interrogation room when we arrived, his expression smug, like he was expecting to see the broken woman he'd left behind. But when I walked in, his smirk faltered. I sat down across from him and smiled, not warmly, but like I already knew the ending. "Hello, Victor," I said evenly. Or should I say Victor Roman? Or was it something else before that? I lose track of all your names. He leaned back, trying to recover. "I see prisons made you bitter." I tilted my head. "Prison made me patient. Now tell me, how exactly did my husband's blood end up all over my bedroom the night you disappeared? Or should I guess you bought off the lab too?" Something in his eyes shifted. Maybe he thought confession would make him look clever. Or maybe he just wanted me to know how thoroughly he'd played me. "You can't buy a real lab," he said with a shrug. So I cut my own hand with the same knife. A little blood goes a long way. And the champagne? Just one pill knocks you out for hours. By the time you woke up, it was all set. Everyone already believed you'd killed me. I felt my stomach turn, but I forced myself to keep my voice steady. And the infertility, that made him smile, a slow, venomous curve. "Didn't want kids. Easy fix. Slipped something into your food over time. Cost a fortune, but it worked." Stephen's hand tightened on the edge of the table. "That's enough," he said, voice low. "You've just admitted to falsifying evidence, assault, and conspiracy to commit fraud. And we've got it all recorded." Victor's gaze darted to Stephen. "We can work something out, name your price." Stephen stood. "The only thing you're buying now is a cell." When it was over, Victor and Helen were both in custody, each facing the maximum sentence. The judge who'd presided over my trial was exposed for taking bribes and carried out of the courthouse on a stretcher after an apparent stroke. My record was cleared. Walking back into Ellison Couture as its rightful owner felt surreal. I didn't keep a single person from the old guard. Fresh start, new logo, new designs. But the best day wasn't the one I got my company back. It was the one I walked into the waterfront dump in a tailored coat and handed out food and warm clothes to the people who'd once let me search beside them without shoving me away. Some debts aren't paid in money. Stephen and I never talked about what we were to each other at first. He was busy helping me navigate the mess of paperwork, court hearings, and property transfers, and I was busy trying to remember how to live like a free woman. But somewhere between the late-night calls about legal filings and the quiet cups of coffee in his kitchen, I realized I trusted him completely. That was something I hadn't felt in a very long time. It was me who said it one night, sitting across from him on my newly reclaimed porch. "I don't want to just survive anymore, Stephen. I want a life." He looked at me for a long moment, then simply said, "Then let's build one." We were married quietly, no grand gestures, just the two of us and a handful of people who'd earned the right to stand beside us. But something was missing. The house felt too quiet. It was my idea to adopt. "There's space here," I told him. "Enough love for more than just us. And I know you lost your little boy. Maybe we could give another child a home." He nodded without hesitation. "We'll go tomorrow." That's how we met Lily. She was 3 years old, small for her age, sitting alone in the corner of a noisy playroom at the foster center. She didn't speak, not even when I knelt beside her and told her my name, but she slipped her tiny hand into mine, and that was enough. It took months of patience, surgery to fix the limp she'd been left with after an accident, and more bedtime stories than I can count before she spoke her first word to me. I'd been washing windows on a ladder when I lost my footing and twisted my ankle. She came running, eyes wide, and blurted, "Mommy, are you okay?" The word "mommy" filled the room warm and bright. I forgot about the pain entirely. Not long after, life gave us one more miracle. I was pregnant. The doctors couldn't explain it, and I didn't ask them to. All I knew was that the family I thought I'd never have was suddenly real, breathing, laughing under my roof. These days, our evenings are spent in the park, watching Lily race toward the swings while Stephen holds my hand. Sometimes I catch him looking at me with that same steady gaze he had the first day we met, and I realize he saved me in more ways than one. Justice gave me back my name, my company, my home. But Stephen and Lily gave me something even greater. Proof that the life I'd lost wasn't gone forever. It was just waiting for me to fight my way back to it. And I did.